the submarine that surfaced with no crew. The U.S. Navy officially declares that USS Grayling, submarine number SS-209, sank with all hands on September 9, 1943, somewhere in the Philippine Sea after engaging Japanese convoy escorts. 76 men lost, submarine destroyed, case closed, memorial service held, families notified, names added to the list of those who gave their lives in the Pacific War, except I'm holding a photograph right now that was taken on October 18, 1943, 6 weeks after Grayling supposedly sank, and this photograph shows a Scuttle-class submarine surfaced in shallow water off the coast of Mindanao, Philippines, and if you look real close at the conning tower, you can see the hull number painted there, SS-209, and you can see the American flag flying from the Periscope mount, and you can see that the submarine is intact, operational, and completely empty, not a single crew member visible, not a soul on deck, just a ghost ship floating in tropical waters 6 weeks after it was supposed to have been destroyed. And that photograph, that impossible photograph that contradicts the official record, that's just the beginning of a story that's going to make you question everything you think you know about what happened to submarines that went missing in the Pacific, and about how far the Navy will go to bury truths that don't fit their narratives. My name's Sergeant Dean. I spent 41 years in the military, 3 of those years working for naval intelligence investigating unexplained incidents in the Pacific Theater and the Grayling case. What really happened to SS-209 and her crew? That investigation consumed 2 years of my life and led me to conclusions that my superiors absolutely did not want to hear. And when I submitted my final report in 1947, it was immediately classified top secret. I was told to destroy all my working notes, and I was strongly encouraged to forget I'd ever looked into it. But I didn't destroy the notes. I kept copies of everything, kept the witness statements, kept the photographs, kept the documentation that proves the official story is a lie. And now, 80 years later, with almost everyone involved dead or too old to prosecute, I'm going to tell you what really happened to USS Grayling, where that submarine went for 6 weeks, why it came back empty, and what the Navy did when they found it, because the truth is stranger and more disturbing than any cover story they invented.
August 28, 1943, USS Grayling departed Brisbane, Australia on her 8th war patrol, carrying 76 men commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Brinker, experienced skipper, good record. Grayling herself was a Scuttle-class fleet submarine, over 300 feet long, capable of diving to 300 feet, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a deck gun. She'd already sunk 7 Japanese ships in previous patrols, considered a lucky boat by submarine standards, and this patrol was supposed to be routine. Transit to patrol area in the Philippine Sea, intercept Japanese shipping, avoid destroyers, come home. Standard submarine warfare that dozens of boats were doing every day in the Pacific, except Grayling never came home, at least not with her crew. And what happened between August 28 when she left Brisbane and October 18 when she was found empty off Mindanao, that 51-day gap, that's what I spent 2 years trying to piece together.
The official narrative, the one you'll find in Navy records and history books, says that Grayling engaged a Japanese convoy on September 9, 1943, somewhere near the Philippine coast, that during the attack she was depth-charged by convoy escorts, the damage from the depth-charging caused catastrophic flooding, and that the submarine sank with all hands, no survivors, and this narrative is based primarily on Japanese records captured after the war that describe depth-charging an American submarine in that area on that date, and based on the fact that Grayling never returned from patrol and never responded to radio calls, so the Navy declared her lost, presumed sunk with all hands, and moved on because submarines going missing was unfortunately common in the Pacific War. You sent boats out and sometimes they didn't come back, and you rarely found out exactly what happened. But here's what the official narrative don't explain. It don't explain the Filipino fishermen who reported seeing an American submarine surface near Mindanao on October 18th. Don't explain the photograph I'm holding that shows SS-209 intact and afloat 6 weeks after she supposedly sank, and don't explain what was found inside that submarine when Filipino resistance fighters and later American investigators boarded her. Let me start with the fisherman's account because that's where this story really begins. On October 18, 1943, 3 Filipino fishermen, I'm going to call them Miguel, Carlos, and Ramon, though those ain't their real names, these 3 men were fishing in waters off the southern coast of Mindanao, area that was under Japanese occupation at the time. Dangerous waters, Japanese patrol boats everywhere, but these fishermen had families to feed, so they took the risk. And around 0600 hours, they saw something breaking the surface about half a mile from their boat. At first they thought it was a whale, but then they realized it was a submarine, and as it fully surfaced they could see it was American, could see the hull number SS-209, could see the American flag, and they were excited because American submarines meant the Allies were still fighting, meant there was hope, and they expected to see crew members coming up through the hatches, but nobody appeared. The submarine just sat there in the water, engines running, they could hear the diesels but no crew visible. The fishermen debated what to do. Approaching a military vessel was risky, but curiosity and concern for the crew overcame caution, so they motored their small boat closer, and as they got within maybe 50 yards they started shouting, calling out, trying to get someone's attention, but no response. And Miguel, who spoke some English, he yelled, "American submarine, you okay?" And still no response. And now they were worried. Maybe the crew was sick. Maybe there'd been an accident. So despite the danger, they pulled alongside the submarine's hull and Miguel climbed up onto the deck. And he later told investigators that the first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. He could hear the diesel engines rumbling below, could feel the vibration through the deck plates, but couldn't hear any human activity. No voices, no movement, nothing except machinery. And he walked along the deck to the conning tower and looked through the open hatch, expecting to see someone, but the interior was empty, at least the parts he could see from the hatch.
Carlos and Ramon joined Miguel on deck, and the three of them made a decision that was either very brave or very foolish depending on how you look at it. They decided to go inside, to investigate, to see if they could find the crew, and Miguel was the first down the ladder, dropping through the conning tower hatch into the control room, and he described later what he saw. The control room was fully lit, all the instruments were functioning, gauges showing normal readings, the helmsman's station was unmanned but the autopilot appeared to be engaged. The radio was on, crackling with static, the chart table had maps spread out with course lines marked, and everything looked like the crew had just stepped away moments ago, but there was nobody there, and Miguel called up to Carlos and Ramon, "Nobody here, everything working but nobody here," and they descended into the submarine to search further. Over the next maybe 20 minutes, the three Filipino fishermen moved through USS Grayling, and what they found was documented later in statements they gave to American intelligence, though those statements were classified and never made public. They found the forward torpedo room, 6 tubes loaded, 2 additional torpedoes in their racks, launch mechanisms ready, but no torpedo men. They found crew berthing areas, bunks made, personal effects still in lockers, photographs of families, letters from home, everything a submarine crew keeps to remind them of what they're fighting for, but no crew. They found the galley, and this is important, they found coffee in a pot, and Miguel specifically remembered touching the pot and finding it warm, not hot like it had just been made, but warm like it had been made maybe 30 or 40 minutes earlier. And there was food preparation in progress. Someone had been making breakfast, bread dough rising, vegetables partially chopped, but no cook. They found the engine room, both diesel engines running smoothly, fuel tanks reading 3/4 full, no damage, no leaks, no signs of flooding or combat damage, everything functioning perfectly, but no engineers. And here's what really disturbed them. As they moved through the submarine, Miguel said they heard sounds, not mechanical sounds, but sounds like footsteps in the next compartment, sounds like someone moving around just out of sight, and several times they'd enter a compartment thinking they'd find someone, and it would be empty, but they'd hear the footsteps again further forward or aft, like someone was avoiding them, and this scared them enough that after their search they quickly exited the submarine and returned to their boat, and Miguel said later, "We were afraid, not of Japanese, afraid of submarine itself, something wrong there, something not natural," and they motored away and reported what they'd seen to Filipino resistance fighters who had connections to American forces operating in the area. The resistance took the report seriously because an intact American submarine was valuable intelligence, so they sent a team to investigate. This was October 19th, one day after the fishermen's discovery, and the resistance team, led by a man I'm going to call Lieutenant Santos of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, they approached the submarine, which was still floating in the same location, engines still running, and Santos's team boarded and conducted a more thorough search than the fishermen had, and what they found corroborated the fishermen's account but added new disturbing details. The submarine was completely operational, no battle damage, no flooding, no signs of why the crew would have abandoned ship. The batteries were fully charged, life support systems working, food and water supplies adequate for several more weeks at sea, torpedo inventory nearly full, fuel sufficient for thousands more miles of travel. This was not a damaged submarine limping home. This was a fully capable warship that for some inexplicable reason had no crew. Santos found the ship's log. Standard practice on submarines is to maintain detailed logs of all activities, and he read the last several entries, and I have a copy of these entries because Santos turned a log over to American intelligence and someone made copies before it got classified. The entries from late August and early September describe normal patrol operations, some contacts with Japanese shipping, evasive maneuvers to avoid destroyers, routine maintenance, nothing unusual. But then there's an entry dated September 9th, 1943, timestamp 0430 hours, and this entry, written in the commanding officer's handwriting, says, "Heavy depth charging, pressure hull compromised, flooding in forward torpedo room and aft engine room, damage control unable to contain, batteries cracked releasing chlorine gas, giving order to abandon ship, may God protect my crew." And that entry ends with Brinker's signature, and that's the last entry by Brinker, but it ain't the last entry in the log. The next entry is dated September 11th, 2 days later, no timestamp, handwriting is different, looks rushed or distressed, and it says, "Flooding stopped, pumps operational, submarine surfaced, chlorine gas cleared, unable to locate crew, continuing search, maintaining position," and it's not signed, don't say who wrote it, and there's more entries over the following weeks, different handwriting, sometimes barely legible, describing the submarine's position, navigation coordinates, fuel consumption, maintenance performed, all the routine administrative entries you'd expect to find in a submarine log, except there's no crew listed, no names, no signatures, just anonymous entries documenting a submarine's alteration by persons unknown, and the final entry is dated October 17th, 1943, one day before the fishermen found the boat, and it says simply, "Position compromised, proceeding to secondary extraction point, we made it home." And that phrase, "we made it home," that was written in block letters, emphasized, like whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it was seen and understood. Santos also found something else, and this detail never made it into any official report, but Santos told me about it personally when I interviewed him in 1946. He found on the Periscope housing, written in grease pencil, the same phrase, "We made it home," and underneath it a list of 76 names, every man who'd been aboard USS Grayling when she left Brisbane, 76 names written carefully, almost reverently, like a memorial, and Santos said when he saw that list he got chills because it looked like a crew roster written by dead men, and he ordered his team to leave the submarine immediately. And they did, and they reported their findings to American military intelligence through resistance channels, and within 48 hours, U.S. Navy personnel arrived to take custody of the submarine.
Now let me tell you what the Navy found, because I was part of the investigation team. I wasn't senior, I was just a sergeant attached to Naval Intelligence, but I was there when we boarded Grayling. This was October 21st, 1943, and I seen everything firsthand. We approached the submarine with a team of 12 men, mix of submarine qualified personnel, intelligence officers, and security. We had orders to secure the vessel, determine what happened to the crew, and prepare the submarine for either recovery or scuttling depending on her condition. And when we boarded, I immediately understood why the fishermen and Santos's team had been spooked. The submarine felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. She felt wrong, like you were being watched, like you weren't alone even though you could clearly see you were alone. And several men on our team commented on this feeling, this sense of presence that didn't have a physical source. We conducted a compartment-by-compartment search looking for any sign of the crew, any bodies, any evidence of what happened, and we found what previous investigators had found, an operational submarine with no crew, but we also found things that raised more questions. In the radio room, we found transmission logs, and these logs showed that someone had been sending radio messages from Grayling after September 9th, after the date she supposedly sank. Messages to Pearl Harbor Naval Headquarters, routine position reports, weather observations, patrol updates. Exactly the kind of traffic a submarine on patrol would send, except Pearl Harbor's records showed they never received these transmissions. The messages were sent but never received, like they were being transmitted into the void. And when we examined the radio equipment, everything was functioning properly. No reason the transmissions shouldn't have been received, but they weren't. Or if they were, someone at Pearl Harbor decided not to acknowledge them. In the captain's cabin, we found Brinker's personal effects, his letters from home, photographs of his wife and 2 daughters, his uniform hanging in the closet, everything exactly as he left it, and on his desk there was a letter, unsealed, addressed to his wife, and I read that letter. I probably shouldn't have, but I did, and it was dated September 8th, 1943, one day before the depth charging incident, and Brinker wrote about how much he missed his family, how he was looking forward to coming home, how he believed the war would be over soon and they'd all be together again. Normal letter from a husband and father who expected to survive the war, and reading that letter, knowing Brinker and his crew were gone, that hit me hard, made the whole situation feel more real, more tragic. In the engine room, our engineering specialist, a chief petty officer named Morrison, he examined the diesel engines and he couldn't explain how they were still running. Submarines don't have huge fuel capacity, you gotta manage your fuel carefully, and based on the fuel consumption rate and the amount remaining in the tanks, Morrison calculated that the engines had been running continuously or near continuously for the 6 weeks since Grayling allegedly sank, and that meant someone had been monitoring fuel levels, managing engine operation, performing routine maintenance, all the things that keep diesel engines running, except there was nobody there to do those things. And Morrison said, "Sergeant, these engines should have seized up or run out of fuel weeks ago. I don't know how they're still operational." And I asked, "Is it possible they've been maintained?" And Morrison said, "Possible, yes, but by who?" We found the torpedo tubes loaded and ready, and our weapons specialist said the torpedoes showed signs of recent maintenance. Somebody had checked the firing mechanisms, topped off the compressed air flasks, performed the routine care that prevents torpedoes from degrading, and this would have required technical knowledge and access to tools and parts, not something that happens automatically. And again, the question was who? Who was maintaining this submarine? Who was performing all these technical tasks that require human hands and human knowledge? And we had no answer except that maybe the crew hadn't all died. Maybe some of them survived and operated the submarine and then left before we arrived. But if that was true, where did they go? And why didn't they take their personal effects? And why wasn't there any record of where they went or what happened to them after they presumably left the submarine? The most disturbing find came when we examined the navigation systems. Submarines navigate using dead reckoning, celestial observations, and in 1943 they had basic radar. You plot your course, you track your position, you record everything in navigation logs, and we found these logs, and they showed a route from the position where Grayling was depth-charged on September 9th to the position where she was found off Mindanao on October 18th. And that route, the course that was plotted and apparently followed, it made no sense. It involved traveling through areas known to be heavily patrolled by Japanese forces. It involved multiple course changes that suggested evasive maneuvers. It involved precise navigation that would have required constant position fixes and careful seamanship, and all of this over 6 weeks while the submarine supposedly had no crew, and our navigation specialist said this is impossible. No way a submarine navigates this route without experienced personnel operating her. The course plotting alone would require daily celestial observations. You can't automate that in 1943. And I agreed it was impossible, but the evidence was right there in the logs. Someone had navigated this submarine across hundreds of miles of hostile waters with apparent skill and precision. We also found something that wasn't in any previous reports, probably because the fishermen in Santos's team didn't know what they were looking at. In the conning tower, there was a modification to the periscope mount. Someone had rigged up a camera system, looked like it was salvaged from aircraft reconnaissance equipment, and this camera was set up to automatically photograph whatever the periscope was aimed at. And there was film in the camera, partially exposed roll, and we developed that film later, and what we found on it was a series of images taken over several weeks, images of Japanese ships, images of coastlines, images of what looked like navigation references, images that proved someone had been using the
Periscope, had been conducting reconnaissance, had been operating the submarine as a warship, even though there was no crew visible anywhere. And some of those images, particularly the ones from late September and early October, showed things that didn't make sense, showed what looked like figures on the deck of the submarine, shadowy shapes that might have been people but weren't clear enough to identify. And in one image, taken by setting up the camera to photograph the deck, you could see what looked like footprints and condensation on the deck plates, fresh footprints, but nobody was visible in the image making those footprints. After 3 days of investigation aboard Grayling, we documented everything we could find. We'd collected the logs and personal effects, we'd photographed every compartment, we'd taken detailed notes on the condition of all systems, and we'd come no closer to understanding what happened to the crew or who'd been operating the submarine for 6 weeks. And our commanding officer, a naval commander named Patterson, he called a meeting of the investigation team and he said, "Gentlemen, we have a situation here that I don't know how to report. We have a submarine that by all accounts should be at the bottom of the ocean. Instead, she's floating here operational with no crew. We have evidence that she's been actively operated for 6 weeks after her crew allegedly died. We have navigation logs and radio transmissions and maintenance records that prove someone was aboard doing technical work, but we can't find anyone. We can't find bodies. We can't find any explanation that makes sense. And if we report this truthfully, we're going to create more questions than answers and probably cause panic about ghost submarines operating in the Pacific." Patterson made a decision right there, and I don't fault him for it given the circumstances and the information available to him. He decided that USS Grayling needed to disappear, permanently, that the submarine was a liability that raised too many uncomfortable questions, and that the best solution was to scuttle her immediately and report that we'd found the wreckage of Grayling and confirm she'd sunk with all hands on September 9th as originally believed. And I spoke up, probably shouldn't have. I said, "Sir, with respect, we have evidence that contradicts that conclusion. We have logs and photographs and testimony from Filipino witnesses." And Patterson said, "Sergeant, I understand your concern, but the greater issue here is maintaining confidence in our submarine operations. If word gets out that submarines can operate themselves, that crews can disappear and vessels continue functioning, that's going to create superstitions and fear among submariners that'll affect combat effectiveness. Sometimes the truth is less important than morale and operational security." And I said, "So we're just going to bury the evidence?" And Patterson said, "Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do."
October 24, 1943, USS Grayling was scuttled using depth charges. We placed charges in her hull, opened her vents, and sent her to the bottom in water deep enough that she'd never be recovered. And as I watched that submarine sink, I felt like we were destroying evidence of something important, something that might help us understand what happens to men who go missing in combat. But orders are orders, and Patterson made the call, and we executed it. And the official report filed with Naval Headquarters said that investigation team had located and identified wreckage of USS Grayling, confirmed she sank on September 9, 1943 with all hands lost, and recommended posthumous commendations for Lieutenant Commander Brinker and his crew for their service and sacrifice. And that became the official record, the story that went into history books, and nobody except the people who'd been aboard that empty submarine knew the truth.
But I kept investigating, couldn't let it go. Over the next year, I tracked down and interviewed everyone who'd had contact with Grayling during those 6 weeks. The Filipino fishermen, Lieutenant Santos and his resistance fighters, even managed to interview some Japanese naval personnel after the war who'd been operating in that area. And what I found was a pattern of sightings and encounters that the official record ignored. Multiple reports of an American submarine operating alone in waters off the Philippines during September and October 1943. Reports from Filipino civilians who said they'd seen a submarine surface at night. Reports from Japanese patrol gun crews who said they tracked a submarine that seemed to evade them with impossible skill. Even a report from an American coast watcher, a guy stationed on a remote island observing Japanese movements, who said he'd seen through binoculars what looked like USS Grayling surfaced near his island in late September. And he tried to signal the submarine but got no response. Submarine just sat there for maybe 20 minutes, then submerged and left. And when this coast watcher reported the sighting to his superiors, they told him he must have been mistaken because Grayling was listed as sunk. I also found radio intercepts. These were classified documents that I technically shouldn't have had access to, but I had connections. And these intercepts showed that naval radio stations at Pearl Harbor and in Australia had picked up fragmentary transmissions that appeared to be from Grayling after her presumed sinking. Transmissions that were logged but never acknowledged, never acted upon, just filed away as anomalies or possible Japanese deception. And looking at these intercepts, I could see clear patterns, position reports that matched where the submarine was later found, requests for orders that were never answered, even a message dated October 15th that said, "Crew status uncertain, vessel operational, requesting guidance on whether to continue patrol or return to base." And that message was signed with Brinker's call sign, but Naval Headquarters logged it as probable enemy deception and didn't respond. And I wonder what would have happened if they had responded. If they'd sent a vessel to investigate, would they have found Grayling sooner? Would they have found the crew or evidence of what happened to them? Or would they have just found an empty submarine like we did 3 days later?
The most significant interview I conducted was with Lieutenant Santos, the resistance fighter who'd first boarded Grayling. I met with him in 1946 in Manila after the war ended, and we talked for hours about what he'd seen. And Santos told me things he hadn't included in his official report, things that bothered him but that he didn't know how to explain. He said, "When we were inside Submarine, we heard voices, not loud, like whispers, like people talking in next room. We would go to where we thought the voices came from and nobody would be there, but we would hear them again somewhere else. And it wasn't wind through the vents, it wasn't machinery, it was voices, speaking English, saying things I couldn't make out, but definitely human voices, and my men heard it too. We all heard it, and it scared us more than Japanese would have." And I asked Santos if he thought the voices might have been survivors hiding somewhere, and he said, "No, we searched everywhere, every compartment, every space large enough for a man to hide. Submarine wasn't that big. If there were survivors, we would have found them, but we found nobody, just voices with no source." Santos also told me about something he found but didn't report officially. He said in the captain's cabin he found a photograph. Wasn't there when we examined the cabin later, so he must have taken it or moved it, but he described it to me. Said it was a crew photograph, all 76 men posed in front of Grayling. Typical submarine crew photo. And Santos said, "I looked at that photo and I saw their faces, young men, smiling, proud, and I thought about how all of them were gone, and how their submarine was still here, still operating, like it was waiting for them to come back. And he gave me that photograph. He'd kept it all those years, and I still have it. And sometimes I look at those faces and I wonder where they went. What happened in those moments after Brinker gave the order to abandon ship? Did they make it out of the submarine? Did they survive in the water? Did something else happen that we can't explain or understand?" And I got no answers, just questions and a photograph of men who disappeared. I found one more piece of evidence that I think is crucial to understanding this case. In 1944, I was reviewing Japanese naval records that had been captured. We were trying to learn about their anti-submarine tactics, and I found a report from a Japanese destroyer captain who described an encounter on September 9, 1943 with an American submarine, and the location and time matched exactly when and where Grayling was depth charged, and this captain described dropping 37 depth charges on the submarine. He described hearing underwater explosions that suggested he damaged the target. He described seeing oil and debris surface, which typically indicates a submarine has been destroyed, and he concluded that he'd successfully sunk an American submarine. And based on that report, the Navy declared Grayling lost. But here's what's interesting. The same Japanese captain's report includes an addendum dated September 11th, 2 days later, where he reports sonar contact with a submarine in the same area, and he describes attempting to engage this contact, but the submarine evaded at high speed and escaped. And the captain notes, "Submarine behavior consistent with Gado-class vessel, possible survivor of previous engagement, unusual evasion tactics suggest experienced crew." And that addendum was never shared with American intelligence, or if it was ignored, but it suggests that Grayling survived the initial depth charging, that Brinker and his crew might have successfully evaded, and that the submarine was still operational 2 days later, just like the log entries suggest. So here's what I think happened, and this is speculation based on evidence, but I can't prove it definitively. I think USS Grayling was depth charged on September 9th, took damage but not catastrophic damage. Brinker believed the damage was worse than it actually was. Maybe chlorine gas from cracked batteries was affecting judgment. Maybe flooding looked worse in the moment than it actually was, and he gave the order to abandon ship. Crew evacuated, got out through hatches, but then something happened. Maybe Japanese destroyers were still in the area and the crew couldn't surface safely. Maybe they were swept away by currents, maybe they were captured. I don't know, but somehow the crew ended up separated from their submarine, and the submarine, which was actually still operational, remained afloat. And then here's where it gets strange. Someone or something operated that submarine for the next 6 weeks, navigated it hundreds of miles, maintained the engines, performed technical operations, sent radio messages, conducted reconnaissance, and either that someone was a survivor or survivors who for some reason didn't evacuate with the rest of the crew, or something else was operating the submarine, something we don't have a rational explanation for. The alternative explanation, the one that nobody in naval intelligence wanted to consider but that some of us discussed privately, is that the crew didn't entirely leave, that their presence remained in the submarine even after their physical bodies were gone, that somehow their determination to complete their mission, to bring their boat home, persisted beyond death. And I know how that sounds. I know it seems impossible, but explain the voices Santos heard, explain the navigation logs showing precise seamanship with no crew, explain the maintenance performed on complex machinery with nobody there to perform it, explain the message, "We made it home," written after the crew was supposed to be dead. Explain all of it using conventional logic, and you can't. Something happened aboard USS Grayling that don't fit into our understanding of how the world works, and the Navy's response to scuttle the submarine and classify all evidence suggests they knew that and didn't want anyone asking questions about it.
I submitted my final report to Naval Intelligence in 1947. It was 200 pages, included all the evidence I'd collected, all the witness statements, all the photographs and logs and intercepts, and I concluded that USS Grayling had not sunk on September 9, 1943, that she'd remained operational for at least 6 weeks after that date, that someone or something had operated her during that period, and that the official explanation of her loss was inaccurate and possibly deliberately falsified. And I recommended that the Navy reopen the investigation, attempt to locate the crew or determine their fate, and acknowledge that something unexplained had occurred, and the response I got from my commanding officer was brief. He called me into his office, handed back my report with a big red classified stamp across the front, and said, "Sergeant Dean, this report will never see the light of day. It raises questions that have no good answers, it contradicts official records, and it would damage the Navy's credibility if made public. You did thorough work, but the conclusion is unacceptable. The official record stands. Grayling sank with all hands on September 9, 1943. That's the truth as far as the Navy is concerned, and I'm ordering you to destroy all copies of this report and never discuss this matter again." And I said, "Sir, what about the evidence? What about the witnesses?" And he said, "The evidence has been destroyed, the submarine was scuttled, the witnesses have been instructed to remain silent, some were paid for their silence, others were threatened, and this conversation ends now." So that's what happened to my investigation. It got buried like the submarine got buried, and for decades I kept quiet like I was ordered to, but I never destroyed my notes, never got rid of the evidence, and now I'm old, and the people who ordered me to stay silent are dead, and I don't care anymore about protecting institutional secrets. I care about truth, care about honoring the 76 men of USS Grayling who disappeared, care about deserving a story that might help us understand what happens to people who go missing in war, and whether sometimes their missions continue even after their bodies stop. And I want people to know that the official Navy history is wrong, that Grayling didn't sink on September 9th, that she operated for weeks afterward, that something impossible happened and the Navy covered it up because acknowledging it would raise questions they couldn't answer. In 1960, the Navy declassified some Grayling records, released a brief account of her final patrol, maintained the story that she'd been sunk by death charges with all hands lost, published a memorial listing all 76 crew members, and that became the historical record, and families of those men got that as the official explanation of what happened to their loved ones, and I think that's wrong. I think those families deserve to know the truth, or at least as much truth as we can piece together. They deserve to know that their men might have survived the initial depth charging, that they might have abandoned ship believing it was necessary, that something unexplained happened after that, and that the Navy don't know and probably will never know what became of them, but at least that's honest, at least that acknowledges the mystery instead of pretending there wasn't one. I found one final piece of information that I think deserves to be part of this story. In 2003, 60 years after Grayling disappeared, a Filipino fisherman, son of one of the original 3 who found the empty submarine, he contacted me through veterans channels, said his father had recently died and before dying had told him something he'd never told anyone else. His father said that when they were aboard the empty submarine in October 1943, when they were in the control room, he'd seen something through the periscope, and he'd looked through it and seen the image of men swimming in the water, dozens of men in life jackets, and he'd thought that was strange because he just looked outside and the water around the submarine was empty, but through the periscope he could see these men swimming, and he recognized them as American sailors from their uniforms, and he called to his companions to look, but when they looked through the periscope the image was gone, water was empty. And this fisherman, Miguel, he believed for the rest of his life that he'd seen the ghosts of Grayling's crew, seen them in the moment they'd abandoned ship, seen them swimming away from their submarine, not knowing what would happen to them. And he'd said, "I saw them trying to make it home, and maybe they did, maybe they made it home in a way we don't understand." And that story, that image of 76 men swimming away from a submarine that would continue operating without them, that haunts me, makes me wonder about what home means, whether bringing a submarine back to friendly waters counts as making it home, even if the crew ain't physically aboard, and whether sometimes determination and duty persist beyond life itself. So that's the story of USS Grayling. That's what really happened versus what the official Navy history says happened, and if you take anything from this, it should be that history is often incomplete, that the official versions of events are sanitized and simplified, that governments and militaries bury evidence when the truth is too strange to fit into their narratives, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that get classified and hidden because they threaten institutional credibility. And I'm telling this story now because someone needs to, because the 76 men of Grayling deserve to have their real story preserved, and because the truth matters even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. So share this if you think it's important. Help make sure this story survives. And remember that the men who serve often pay prices we never hear about, face situations we can't imagine, and sometimes those situations involve mysteries that defy explanation, but that don't make them less real, don't make the sacrifice less meaningful, and don't mean we should forget just because understanding is difficult. Thank you for listening. Thank you for helping preserve these buried files, and I'll see you in the next one. Sergeant Dean out.